Picture this, if you will. The year is 1815. Across Europe, cities gleam with marble facades and soaring aqueducts. Latin remains the common tongue of commerce and scholarship. Steam-powered mills and early mechanical looms operate under permits issued by an imperial bureaucracy descended directly from Caesar Augustus. Above the rooflines, eagles still watch, not as history's echoes, but as living symbols of a continuous civilization spanning 2 millennia without interruption. In our world, the Roman Empire fell. The last emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD. This collapse triggered what we call the Dark Ages. Centuries of fragmentation, lost knowledge, and civilizational retreat. But what if that collapse had never happened? What if the Roman Empire, battered and threatened though it was, had found the will and the structure to persist? What if the late imperial reforms had taken hold? What if political assassinations had been avoided? What if the military had held the line? Today, on Alternate Ages, we're asking, how might human civilization have developed if Rome had never fallen? What would modernity look like? Would science have advanced more smoothly? Would Europe have united centuries before it actually did? And what does this counterfactual tell us about the fragile contingency of our own history? History balanced on a knife's edge, and today we're walking the other side of it. To understand how Rome might have endured, we first need to appreciate just how close it actually came to surviving. By 270 AD, the Roman Empire faced systemic crisis. The 3rd century crisis, as historians call it, had fractured the state into competing regional powers. Plague, barbarian incursions, and civil wars had drained the imperial treasury and demoralized the legions. The very machinery of empire seemed to be grinding toward collapse. Heather, Peter, The Fall of the Roman Empire, 2005. Enter Aurelian, a military commander of extraordinary ability who seized power in 270 AD. In just 5 years, Aurelian accomplished what seemed impossible. He reunified the fragmented empire, defeated the Palmyrene breakaway state in the east, and the Gallic Empire in the northwest. He reinforced the frontier, reformed the currency, and restored imperial prestige. Contemporaries called him Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Jones, AHM, The Later Roman Empire, 1964. Aurelian died in 275 AD, assassinated by his own officers, a fate not uncommon for powerful generals in this period. But his legacy was clear. The empire could be saved if someone had the military acumen and political will to do so. After Aurelian came emperors of varying competence, but the basic reforms he'd instituted persisted through the reign of Diocletian, who divided the empire for administrative purposes, creating an eastern and western structure that provided both stability and flexibility. Source: Gibbon, Edward. The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 1776-1789. By 400 AD, the historical timeline becomes even more precarious. The Western Empire faced unprecedented barbarian pressure. Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, pressed against the Rhine and Danube frontiers. It was a general named Stilicho, part Vandal and extraordinarily talented, who held the line for decades. He defeated Alaric the Visigoth repeatedly, shored up the Danube frontier, and preserved imperial authority in the west well into the early 5th century. Yet in 408 AD, Stilicho was executed by political rivals at the court of the young emperor Honorius. Historians largely agree his death was catastrophic. Without Stilicho, the military coherence of the Western Empire collapsed within a generation. Alaric sacked Rome in 410. The institutions that had held barbarian invasions at bay simply ceased to function. Heather, Peter. The Fall of the Roman Empire, 2005. So we have our historical foundations, a proven capability for imperial reform under Aurelian, administrative structures that worked, and a military officer in Stilicho whose death marked the point of no return. Rome didn't fall due to inevitable decay. It fell due to specific contingencies, specific decisions, specific assassinations. Now, let us imagine an alternate path. Imagine, if you will, that Aurelian's reforms had not merely inspired later emperors, but had become institutionalized. What if, in the decades following his death, the empire had learned from his example? What if successive emperors had continued his military discipline, his currency reforms, his administrative centralization? Or consider another possibility. What if Stilicho had not been assassinated in 408 AD? What if political factions at the court of Honorius had recognized his indispensability? What if the Western Empire had retained its most capable military mind precisely when it most needed him? Perhaps it would have been both, a permanent elevation of military standards combined with the survival of an extraordinary commander. In this alternate timeline, the Western Empire does not fragment. The legions, properly supplied and led, continue to hold the Rhine. The Germanic tribes are not expelled from the empire. That would be unrealistic, but rather integrated into its military structure, much as Rome had done with foreign soldiers throughout its history. The administrative apparatus persists. Latin remains the language of law, scholarship, and commerce. The complex tax system, the postal network, the legal traditions that have been refined over centuries, they continue to evolve and adapt rather than catastrophically collapse. This is the moment where history branches. This is the knife's edge upon which we tread. In our world, the Western Empire fell. In this world, it endured. What follows from this survival? Let us trace the consequences thread by thread. First, politically. The continuous Roman state would have evolved, certainly. Empires are not static, but it would have evolved from within its own traditions. The feudal system that emerged in our medieval Europe arose precisely because imperial authority had collapsed and regional strongmen filled the vacuum. Without that collapse, feudalism as we know it would never form. Instead, we might expect a continued evolution of late imperial administration. The theme system that actually developed in the Byzantine Empire could have spread westward. The empire might have developed into a federal structure of provinces, each with appointed governors, all answerable to a central imperial court. Source: McCormick, Michael. Origins of the European Economy, 2001. By the early medieval period, what would still be medieval, but a different kind, we might see the Roman Empire as a political federation of Mediterranean and European territories, governed by a permanent bureaucracy, all conducting business in Latin. The concept of medieval Christendom would still exist. The empire would have Christianized, but it would be unified under Roman law rather than fragmented among competing kingdoms. Second, intellectually and scientifically. The Dark Ages earned their name because of a genuine loss of literacy, learning, and accumulated knowledge. Libraries burned, texts were lost. The machinery of education, which had been maintained in Roman institutions, fell silent. When learning began to recover, it had to be painstakingly reconstructed from fragments. often through the mediation of Islamic scholars who have preserved classical texts. Constantinople in the age of Justinian, 1960. In our alternate timeline, this collapse never occurs. The libraries of Rome, Alexandria, and Constantinople are continuously maintained. Scholarship in natural philosophy, mathematics, and engineering never experiences the centuries-long interruption. What might have accumulated by the year 1400? The scientific method, which actually emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries through the gradual refinement of classical and Islamic learning, might have developed centuries earlier within a continuous Roman intellectual framework. A Roman scholar of the 14th century would not be reaching backward to recover lost Greek texts. They would be building upon a living, continuous tradition. By 1600, in this alternate Europe, we might expect proto-scientific societies, mechanical innovations, and mathematical advances that would astound our timeline's scholars. The printing press, when invented, would distribute texts across an already literate empire. The agricultural revolution of our 18th century might have arrived in the alternate timeline in the 16th. Third, religiously and culturally. Christianity would still, almost certainly, have become the empire's official religion. That trajectory was well established by the time of our divergence point. But the Church's role would have developed differently. In our timeline, as Roman political authority fragmented, the Catholic Church became the primary institution maintaining continuity. The Pope became both spiritual and temporal authority. In the alternate timeline, the Emperor remains the preeminent authority. The Church would have developed within a framework of state regulation, rather than as a separate political power, gradually accumulating authority. This might have prevented the schisms and conflicts that marked medieval Christendom, or it might have produced different ones. An established imperial church might have been more unified, less subject to the factional disputes that actually divided East from West in 1054 AD. Alternatively, theological controversies might have taken on a different character, framed within imperial legal structures rather than through papal authority. Culturally, the Mediterranean would have remained the center of gravity rather than shifting northward. In our timeline, after the fall of the Western Empire, cultural and economic importance migrated northward to what became France, then to Atlantic trade routes, eventually to Britain and America. In the alternate timeline, Rome and its environs, Constantinople and the Eastern Mediterranean would have remained the civilizational center. Greek and Latin would have remained the languages of prestige. The European peripheries would have developed differently, perhaps more slowly. Fourth, militarily and territorially. Without the collapse of the Western Empire, the barbarian kingdoms of the early medieval period simply do not form as they did in our timeline. The Visigothic kingdom of Iberia, the Frankish kingdom, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, these emerge from the power vacuum created by imperial collapse. Without that collapse, these do not emerge at all. Instead, barbarian tribes that would have invaded are instead recruited, much as Rome had always done, into imperial military service. North Africa remains firmly under imperial control. In our timeline, the Vandals conquered North Africa and disrupted Mediterranean trade for centuries. In the alternate timeline, they are integrated, or, if they resist, decisively defeated by a functioning imperial military. The Mediterranean remains an imperial lake, not a contested frontier. The implications for the Islamic expansion are profound. In our timeline, the Islamic caliphates, beginning in the 7th century, conquered the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa. because those territories had been exhausted and fragmented by wars between the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire. Heather, Peter, The Fall of the Roman Empire, 2005. In the alternate timeline, a unified, strengthened Roman Empire, still encompassing both Mediterranean and Balkan territories, would present a formidable obstacle to expansion. The Islamic caliphates would not be prevented, but they might be contained more effectively. They might not reach Iberia, might not establish the centuries-long confrontation that actually shaped medieval Europe. History takes a different trajectory. Fifth, economically, a continuous Roman state with unbroken administrative capacity would have maintained and expanded the trade networks that actually developed most fully in the later medieval and early modern periods. The Silk Road would have been not a peripheral concern, but a central imperial project. The Mediterranean trade that actually recovered in the 12th and 13th centuries under Venetian and Genoese merchant republics would have been state-directed imperial trade from far earlier. With accumulated capital, continuous technical knowledge, and uninterrupted economic institutions, the conditions for industrial development might arrive centuries early. By 1500 AD, in the alternate timeline, we might see mechanized production, water-powered mills on a vast scale. Early steam technology developed not in 18th century Britain, but in the heartland of an advanced Roman civilization. By 1700, the alternate Roman Empire might not be preparing for an industrial revolution. It would already be in the midst of one. Factories would operate under imperial charter. Trade would be conducted in standardized measures derived from Roman tradition. The technological advantage over other civilizations would be enormous. Sixth, and perhaps most dramatically, colonization of the Americas. In our timeline, this was undertaken by late medieval European states, Spain, Portugal, England, operating at the periphery of Mediterranean civilization. In the alternate timeline, the advanced Roman Empire would have developed oceanic exploration centuries earlier, driven not by peripheral kingdoms seeking wealth, but by a central imperial authority seeking to extend its dominion. Imagine Roman navigators discovering the American continent in the 16th century, or perhaps the 15th, backed by the full resources of an imperial state. Colonies would not be established by independent trading companies, but by Roman military and administrative authority. The Americas would be integrated into a worldwide Roman system, governed according to Roman law, populated by Roman settlers and enslaved peoples according to Roman practice. The implications are staggering. The alternate Roman Empire of 1700 would control both the Atlantic and Pacific trade routes. It would be the global superpower, not in the sense of military dominance alone, but in the sense of civilizational reach. An alternate modern world would have evolved from Roman premises, Roman law, Roman administration, Roman cultural norms, rather than from the fragmented, competing European nation-states that actually developed. Let us step back and consider what actually happened and how starkly different it was. In our timeline, Rome fell. The collapse was neither sudden nor inevitable, but it was complete. The Western Empire fragmented into competing kingdoms. Latin evolved into the Romance languages. The unifying legal and administrative apparatus shattered. Education, trade, and learning contracted dramatically. What emerges over the next 1,000 years is a fragmented, gradually recovering Europe. Frankish kingdoms, Holy Roman emperors claiming Roman authority without actually possessing it, competing papacy and secular powers. the gradual development of nation-states, religious division, and ultimately, the modern world as we know it. Our actual history was shaped by this fragmentation. The Renaissance recovered classical learning because it had been lost. The Enlightenment emerged as a reaction against religious authority that had filled the vacuum left by political collapse. The scientific revolution happened as it did because of the particular trajectory of post-Roman European culture. The alternate timeline, by contrast, would have developed continuously from Roman premises. There would have been no Dark Ages, only a transition. No recovery of classical learning, because that learning was never lost. It evolved continuously. No religious fragmentation in the same way, because unified imperial authority would have structured religious development. No emergence of competing European nation-states, because they would never have formed. The empire would have continued, adapting and evolving, but fundamentally continuous. Which world would be better? That is not for the historian to say. The alternate Rome might have been more stable or more stagnant. The continuous empire might have been more oppressive, more uniform, less innovative. Our actual history, chaotic as it was, produced extraordinary human achievement precisely through its fragmentation and competition. The alternate timeline might have sacrificed some of that competitive dynamism for the sake of order and continuity. What we've traced today is not prophecy. It is something more subtle, a recognition of how utterly contingent history is. Rome did not fall because it was weak or decadent in some inevitable way. Rome fell because Aurelian was assassinated, because Stilicho's political enemies were ruthless, because military leaders made tactical mistakes, because plague arrived at particular moments, because barbarian tribes happened to invade when defenses happened to be down. These were not forces of history. These were decisions, accidents, and contingencies. History balanced on a knife's edge. The timeline we know is just one of infinite possibilities. Every era, every moment contains within it multiple futures. The fall of Rome was one. The persistence of Rome was another. The fact that we inhabit the first timeline rather than the second should humble us about the relationships between causation and inevitability. But what if it hadn't happened that way?